Hello everyone and welcome to the channel Crytosophy. In our today's video, we'll try to answer the question whether Bitcoin is going to be the new dollar. And in order to answer this question, we need to go beyond our purely cryptosophical analysis that we did in our previous video, and we need to inject a little bit of economics, albeit we'll still be looking at economic forecasts from a cryptosophical viewpoint. Okay, so what are the major economic forecasts when it comes to the future of Bitcoin? What are their cryptosophical underpinnings? Now, it transpires that there are four basic underpinnings when it comes to various economic predictions with respect to the future of cryptocurrencies in general and Bitcoin specifically. Alright, so let's have a closer look at those underpinnings. Let's start with the elephant in the room, the US dollar inflation. Even the central bank has stopped treating the US dollar inflation as transitory and has started to address it as a point of concern. Now, this situation is further exacerbated by the anticipated reversal in the interest rates. In order to curtail inflation, the interest rates have gone up. But those prohibitively high interest rates are acting to slow down the economy, even jeopardizing the whole economy, since high interest rates means inability to support or take out new loans, credits and mortgages, and this can lead to a much more severe crisis than the one precipitated by the inflation alone. Hence, those high interest rates are going to be reversed to lower values. And those lower values, they may save the economy from a complete crash. But on the other hand, they will further spur the inflation. The inflation will spiral out of control. Now, this spiraling out of control inflation means that there is pressure on the investors, making them look for alternative investments, such as goods, commodities, and alternative currencies. With respect to commodities, the boom has already started. China, for example, has decided to hedge its risks by reevaluating its policy with respect to oil trading. Its oil trading will no longer be tied exclusively to the US dollar. This means a paradigm shift in the global trading scheme, allowing for alternatives to flow in and fill in the gap created by the dip in trust with respect to the US dollar. Now, commodities are a great investment alternative, but they also feature a weak spot. Namely, if you've been following the commodities market quite closely in the recent years, you have probably noticed that commodities tend to move in the same direction. This means that if one of the commodities loses its attractiveness, then other commodities tend to follow suit, and so diversifying within the commodities is not such a great option, since most investment schools put a great emphasis on proper diversification. So what are the alternatives for the commodities? Well, cryptocurrencies can be a great alternative, especially if we consider the fact that more and more central banks and financial institutions throughout the world are adopting new frameworks of regulation for cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin specifically. And this emphasis on legalizing Bitcoin throughout the world is bound to make investment in Bitcoin a more secure investment after all. There is, however, yet another factor that spurs worldwide interest in cryptocurrencies, it's their underexplored potential. Not only new technological features are emerging almost every day, new approaches to smart contracts and distributed finance, but also, if we look at the scale of current adoption, the glaring fact is that there is huge room for further increase in cryptocurrency adoption. Namely, only 4 to 5% of global population are investing in cryptocurrency. And as for the United States, the figure is more pronounced. It's about 21 to 22%, which is still quite modest by the US standards of investment. So this brief analysis of the four major underpinnings of major economic predictions reveals that there seems to be a renewed era of cryptocurrency popularity being ushered in by the changes in investment atmosphere throughout the world. But then you may ask a question: can we actually trust those predictions? All the more, our series here is called 50 Shades of Trust. So, can you trust them completely? Or maybe there are some moot points about them. So, in order to answer this question, one should then proceed from this economic analysis to a cryptosophical analysis. And in order to do this, we should look again at trust, but now give a more mathematical twist to it. So here are my trust erosion equations, and they're pertinent to this economic predictions case, since this basic underpinning that features within those predictions is that of inflation. And increased inflation means decreased trust. So trust and inflation are related in an inverse proportion. And so let's examine the factors that lead to trust erosion. And I believe that there are two main factors that lead to trust erosion that could be represented in two equations. So the first equation at the top, 1 divided by infinity, leads to 0. This equation reflects what can happen if money is printed without limits. So the first equation represents the erosion of trust in a traditional sort of way, in a traditional sense. As you may know, the more money is printed, the less trust there is, and so the less quality there is to money. And so this infinity at the bottom represents the potentially infinite sum of money that can be printed, for example, with respect to fiat money like dollars and some cryptocurrency as well, for example, Ethereum 2.0. As a result, there is zero value as an output. And so the process of devaluation of currency is underway if there are no limits to this infinity at the bottom. Okay, this may seem pretty straightforward and may seem as the only major relationship between quality and quantity when it comes to money. But I believe that there is another relationship, namely the bottom equation, 1 times 0 equals 0. So cryptosophical analysis, however, reveals that there is a second equation that needs to be taken into account when one describes the quality and quantity of money. So the first equation may seem obvious, and it may also seem that the first equation is the only one that is necessary to describe the essential properties of quality and quantity of money. However, I believe that there is a second equation that needs to be added to the first one, and it is the one at the bottom. 1 times 0 equals 0. So what do those numbers stand for? The first number, number 1, stands for the total quantity of money within a given monetary system. The second term, 0, represents zero redeemability of a given monetary system. So this 0 applies only to systems which do not have redeemability built within them. And so as a result, you still get zero. The fundamental property of trust of such a system with zero redeemability is, in the end, zero. The system may exhibit certain characteristics for a given time that are governed by a non-zero quality or value, but in the long run, from a cryptosophical perspective, such a system tends to evolve into zero. So another way to represent this is to look at an equation. Quantity times quality equals value. So this equation is actually a version of the previous equation, except it doesn't have numbers, it has properties here: quality, quantity, and value. So the question you may want to ask is, what is going on with this redeemability? What are the systems for which redeemability is zero? So in order to answer this question, we need to have a look at the difference between redeemability and fungibility. So a superficial look at those definitions yields the same results. So fungible is similar to exchangeable, and redeemable is similar to exchangeable. However, there is a key difference between them. Redeemable implies exchangeable at a fixed rate, whereas fungible means exchangeable without specifying any rate for this exchange. Whereas redeemability means that there is a fixed equivalent. And obviously, if you, for example, if you fix a certain currency to a certain resource, you want this resource to be relatively scarce and to have a fixed value within society, such that the fixed exchange rate translates into fixed value. So in a way, you can say that this value is objective because the value of the resource to which a given currency is tied is fixed. Okay, so gold is a very good example. However, this idea of objectivity has suffered quite a blow from postmodern philosophy and various postmodern movements. And what those movements suggest is that actually there is no objective reality. Instead, you can say that there are either some say that there are subjective realities, or others admit that there could be an intersubjective reality. And so this intersubjective reality in effect replaces objectivity. However, each factor gives this intersubjective reality the propensity to replace objectivity. Well, you can think about it. And it is related to the dichotomy that we discussed in our previous video. It's trust and power. Those are two factors that make intersubjective reality into an objective reality. This is what gives such influence to social systems. That's the way they thrive. That's the way they influence individuals. And that's also a way in which individuals can rely upon those social systems. So if you remember the equation number 2, we discussed that since there is this zero, this void within this equation number 2 and the trust erosion that occurs because of it, there needs to be a constant supply of trust or power to make the system sustainable. Okay, and so there are two forms in which those sources are actually manifested. And one way in which power is manifested is it injects stability, or it provides stability for unlimited supply. So it's like dollar, and we said that this dollar is backed by the influence of the United States of America upon the whole world. Okay, and the second way in which power is injected is the absence of backing, which is true for the dollar, but it's true for Bitcoin as well. And so this enthusiasm that surrounds Bitcoin, or the desire to have an alternative means of investment that is shared intersubjectively by investors is what is driving in a powerful way the proliferation of Bitcoin, its value, and so it acts as a sort of power. Okay, so that may be good. Although if we use postmodern theories that explain the sources of power or the way power itself is manifested, then we arrive at a conclusion that there is another concept that stands higher than power, and so it gives source to power. And this higher notion than power is centralization. So in order for any power to manifest itself, there needs to be some sort of centralization. But wait a minute. Isn't it true that Bitcoin is a decentralized system? Isn't that the whole major point of difference between Bitcoin and conventional currency systems? Now, given the previous discourse has revealed the importance of centralization, or the importance of the topic of centralization, let's discuss this topic in detail. We'll compare the centralization of Bitcoin, if there is any, versus that of conventional networks of financial information exchange. Okay, let's do it. Centralized networks versus the so-called decentralized network, meaning Bitcoin. If we look first at a centralized network, one of the key principles of its architecture is the presence of a central node. And this central node is of utmost importance because in order for information to be properly exchanged and verified, it needs to be recorded on a central node. This record is usually called a ledger. This is a financial ledger of information that contains the essential parameters of exchange between various nodes. So, for example, if you send some money to your friend, this process of sending money is only verified, truly verified, if there is a central node that accounts for the legitimacy of this transfer. Okay, so let's consider Bitcoin now. In a decentralized network like Bitcoin, we've got nodes that essentially communicate with each other without the necessity of communicating this information to a central node. In essence, information that is propagated between any two nodes is then propagated also to other nodes, specifically to all other nodes. And this kind of propagation means that every node is, in a sense, a central node, and so there is no necessity of a central node. So it may seem that there is no centralization in the Bitcoin network. However, in reality, this is not quite true. There are multiple sources of centralization in Bitcoin. Okay, so the first group of centralized elements that are implemented within the Bitcoin network is related to network efficiency and security. So, in principle, the Bitcoin network as such could run without this central node. However, if you want to ensure that the operation is smooth and that there are no malicious actors involved in any of the transactions, you would like to have some functions of the network delegated to this artificial central node. Now, the second centralized component of the Bitcoin network is related to user authentication. For the network to exist, there needs to be a point of entry. It doesn't emerge out of nowhere. There has to be some interface, some portal between the network proper and the outside world. And this exchange between the outside world and the network is what is taking place during user authentication. And so this process has some centralized components to it. However, those two elements of centralization aren't the only two. In fact, even if they didn't exist, there would be still, from a cryptosophical point of view, there would be still some centralization to the network. How come? Well, the point is, even if there is no central node at all, imagine what would happen if any two nodes exchanged information without agreeing on a proper protocol first. This absence of protocol agreement would lead to chaos and would not lead to any storage of meaningful information. It would be even very difficult to describe this concoction of nodes as network proper. And so if any users decide to use different protocols, so if there isn't centralization or standardization with respect to the protocols used, then no decentralized network could be properly called a network. So if a color represents a style of information exchange, and what you see now is a network of various colors, in fact, this network is probably not functional. Now, this is the kind of network that functions properly. All the connections between the nodes are colored in the same way. Okay, so there is another word for such agreements. So one can describe mechanisms that ensure such consistent operation of the network as consensus mechanisms. And even decentralized networks feature consensus mechanisms. Okay, so you may say that if centralization is absolutely inevitable, and there will be some degree of it, at least one can predict the trends, or one can analyze the existing trends. Is Bitcoin centralization increasing or decreasing? Is the centralization of Bitcoin networks on the rise, or is it going down? So, unfortunately, I must say that we've got some bad news. We'll look at it later, but it seems that an increase in centralization is definitely not a boon for a Bitcoin network, since that used to be the main selling point for the adoption of such a network. Okay, so what are the actual centralization trends that proliferate within the Bitcoin network? Some factors that affect centralization are related to exchanges. Okay, so firstly, there is a step up with respect to ID requirements that are necessary to run a node. Obviously, that's related to some security risks. Furthermore, some exchange platforms are going further. They are applying KYC, or Know Your Customer principles. So they go beyond the necessary requirements and they decide to further step up controls, step up the gatekeeping. They think that it's better if they have a selected group of customers rather than anyone. All right, and finally, there are some other elements of security that are tightly controlled by the governments, and they are related to anti-money laundering schemes. On top of that, there is another element of centralization that arises within the Bitcoin network and that starts proliferating. And it's actually interesting that it is not that different from the same elements of centralization that evolve within any social systems, be it animal systems or human systems. The point being, any decentralized system within a social context acquires certain centralization properties through the process of accumulation. Basically, out of the initial conditions with relatively little inequality, huge spikes of inequality follow. And the same is happening for Bitcoin. Specifically, there are issues of unequal size and concentration when it comes to exchanges. So, for example, Coinbase used to dominate exchange platforms for quite a while. Now, mining centers are not distributed uniformly throughout the Bitcoin network, as well as nodes that feature most transactions. They're also concentrated in size, and that leads to certain inequalities and elements of further centralization. Now, if you're feeling sad or concerned because of this increase in centralization, how about you listen to a horror story that would absolutely shock you? Horror stories. So what is this horror story that I'm going to tell you? Actually, this horror story tells you the way governments can enforce their controls over the Bitcoin networks and Bitcoin users, and they can turn the Bitcoin system into a system tied to a fiat currency, namely the US dollar. But how is that possible? So, what you see now is a normal Bitcoin network. There are nodes, they exchange information, and superficially, the governments will say, all right, let's keep it that way, but let's add another layer on top. So what you see here, shown in the green, is more like a mirrored version of the Bitcoin network. It may be smaller. I drew it a little bit smaller than the original. And this mirrored network doesn't seem to do any harm. However, whenever there are transactions that occur in the main part of the network, they will be mirrored in the part of the network that is controlled by the government. And the government can institute an order requiring all the transactions be mirrored. So maybe it's not all that gloomy, even if Bitcoin becomes the new dollar. They will become brothers. And surely the big brother will be watching over the little brother. But they will be a team worthy of an investment, because this investment may yield really juicy returns. If you like the content of our channel, please consider subscribing, and if you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.